Resuming debate, the honourable member for Bay of Quinte.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's an honour to rise today and speak on Bill C-29, the Budget Implementation Act. Prior to my role as the member of the Bay of Quinte, I served for 8 years as the mayor of the City of Belleville. My municipal experience gave me a full appreciation of the impact infrastructure has on our communities. The City of Belleville, being a population of 50,000 and a small urban municipality, has many infrastructure deficits. Investments in infrastructure provide communities with safe roads, clean water and air, efficient transportation networks, and so much more. Our infrastructure needs have outpaced our investments for decades and at significant cost. The perfect storm is here. It is hurting our communities. It is very important we keep driving investment and finding new alternative ways to support the needs of our communities. Neglected aging infrastructure directly contributes to traffic congestion, which pollutes the air and stifles the productivity of our workers and businesses. It contributes to boil water advisories that affect the health of entire communities. It means that our seniors have harder time accessing essential services, and that some of our population have great difficulty finding safe and affordable places to live. As I have personally experienced, underfunded infrastructure puts our cities at a competitive disadvantage. And when competing to attract top companies, either on the world market, local market, or the global market, it's hard to create good-paying jobs without proper infrastructure. The City of Belleville was like so many others, communities across Canada, starved for infrastructure funding and facing a mounting infrastructure deficit. Upon being elected as mayor, I began to see firsthand just how large this infrastructure deficit in our community and how it was growing with no real plan to fix it. Speaking with my colleagues at AMO, Association of Ontario Mayors, which are 444 of us, excluding Toronto, it's an example that I realized most municipalities in Ontario have aging infrastructure. I was finding in my community that we were not unique, and the rest of small urban communities and cities across Canada were in a similar position. There was simply not enough infrastructure funding to meet the needs of municipalities. The tax system, how it is with municipalities, is basically property taxes and user fees, and municipalities provide 66% of our services in Ontario, but yet only collect around 8 cents on the tax dollars. The City of Belleville, an average, again, city, a small city, has over $3.5 billion worth of assets. This includes roads, bridges, 69 bridges, I believe, public facilities, waters, wastewater plants, all that were built in the 40s and 50s and 60s, but never had an asset management plan to keep these structures in repair. After examining this asset management plan, I realized that our city was in trouble. We had probably approximately 350 of 3 years ago dollars in a deficit that was hidden, a deficit that wasn't on our books, and a deficit that kept growing out of control. A construction deficit that increased at the time between 5 and 10%. We had interest rates that we were able to acquire at approximately 2.5% to lock in, and it's all about capital risk. Being a small business person myself, one of the biggest problems was obtaining capital locked in at an amount that got rid of the risk. So with Infrastructure Ontario, we were able to build out a plan, and our solution was a Build Belleville plan. This was a second infrastructure plan to try to alleviate some of the stockpiled infrastructure that was stockpiled to the city over the last 25 years. The rationale is simple. Each year the cost of infrastructure repairs are left and not taken care of, they increase. So all of a sudden a $300 million deficit becomes a 330, 340. And with infrastructure, we're not quite sure of what that costs are be, so it's floating. So coming up with a plan of locking in our capital risk, recognizing that interest rates were low, it was time to launch a plan and try to convince Council that we need to mitigate the risk of bridges collapsing. We had to mitigate the risk of not having a wastewater plant that was capable of meeting our industry. So City Council supported Build Belleville, and that $91.5 million loan for the first stage of infrastructure upgrades and maintenance. The Build Belleville plan was featured in many trade publications, including the Business Review. Municipal World, The Undergrounder, and Renew. The program not only attracted the attention of magazines and media, it attracted a great deal of attention from municipalities. In 2008, I was asked to speak at AMO to all mayors about this plan. My city has also, in this plan, expanded our industrial park by extending roads and services to build our economic base. It put us in a very great position now to attract industry and create more jobs. This past August, I met with local mayors to announce over $7 million in federal gas tax funding. This is specifically for municipal infrastructure projects. More recently, I held an announcement event at our local college, Loyalist College, for a $1.6 million federal investment towards a $3.2 million renovation of the Northumberland Wing and Health and Wellness Center. The Wellness Center hosts the school's highly respected practical nursing program and state-of-the-art clinical simulation lab. This investment will make for greater energy efficiency, which has positive impacts both on the environment and the school's operating budget. And of course, it will significantly improve the learning environment and hopefully keep our youth in our community to get educated and to help in the workforce. These are good reasons as to why it is so vitally important that we continue to work with our municipal and provincial partners across the country to develop a long-term infrastructure plan that meets the real needs of all communities across Canada. Our government will provide more than $180 billion over 12 years for public transit, green and social infrastructure, trade and transportation. These investments have a dramatic impact on all communities across Canada, including small communities and rural regions. This plan provides unprecedented levels of funding for projects across the country, projects that will help create long-term economic growth, build safe, inclusive, and sustainable communities, and support a low-carbon green economy. Budget 16, the first phase of our infrastructure plan, which will invest a total of $11.9 billion. This includes $3.4 billion for public transit systems, $5 billion for green infrastructure projects, and $3.4 billion for social infrastructure. That includes affordable housing. During my community pre-budget consultations, our not-for-profit agencies could not stress enough the importance of investment in safe and affordable housing. This first phase of this investment makes possible repairs and upgrades to long-neglected critical infrastructure. Bilateral agreements were signed with all the provinces and territories, and more than 750 projects have already been approved. Projects already underway in our rural and smaller communities, such as wastewater upgrades in Red Deer, hard surfacing of the Trans-Labrador Highway, upgrades to the town of Lanigan's water facilities in Saskatchewan, rehabilitation of bridges in Northwest Territories, New Pond Inlet Small Craft Harbour in Nunavut, water treatment plant upgrade in my neighbouring town of Deserano. We've also made major investments in infrastructure projects for public transit that, once completed, will help drastically reduce congestion in our cities and get all mums and dads home earlier, hopefully, to spend time with their families and get their families safely home. Phase 2 of the light rail transit in Ottawa, Toronto Transit Commission Surface Track Replacement Program, Waterloo Fairview Mall Transit Terminal, the Trent Severn Waterway National Historic Site, for a total investment of that of $267 million. And I had the great honor on a hot summer day to be with a great Conservative member, the member of Simcoe North in Peterborough, to cut the ribbon on the announcement of the Trent Severn system, which affects my community, as the Trentport Marina in Quinte West is the start of the Trent. And I invite everybody to visit the Trentport Marina in their boats this year and come and enjoy our wineries and enjoy our cities. But having said that, equipping municipalities with resources that need and access to low capital is essential to sustain and grow our communities, providing the building blocks they need to thrive and succeed. Infrastructure is an essential component for healthy, vibrant communities and creates the conditions for sustainable economic growth and development. Investments in infrastructure are investments in our future and that of our children. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Barrie Innisfil.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the honourable member for his speech today. I want to ask about the infrastructure bank, because that was one issue that the Liberal Party did not run on in the last election, in particular the impact of that infrastructure bank on smaller communities. We've already heard, Mr. Speaker, many times in this House that those with a population of 100,000 or less will not benefit from this infrastructure bank. And it also shocked me, and I'd like the members' comment on this. When FCM recently visited Ottawa, I met with them, and I was shocked to learn, Mr. Speaker, that when the Prime Minister had his meeting with the equity banks and investment firms, that there was not one representative from FCM that was at that table. So I'm just wondering if he can confirm that and answer the question about the infrastructure bank. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
For Bay of Quinte.
Thank the honourable member for his question, and I'd like to thank him for his municipal experience. And I know him and I have talked about both our municipal experience. But as we're well aware of capital risk, and when we look at Ontario has an infrastructure program that loans municipalities and Ontarios and gets away with that capital risk. When you look at smaller projects, sometimes are less risky and easier to obtain funds for. When you look at bigger projects that are Canada-wide, or you look at projects that need financing, it's time to look at the capital risk. And if we, through the infrastructure bank, can get these projects pushed forward and get private investment in them and cut down and reduce that capital risk for cities to get these projects done and done on time and on budget, that's what we're trying to do. Thank you for your question.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires? L'honorable.
The honourable member for Rimouski, Neigette, Témiscouata-les-Basques. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague from Bay of Quinte for his speech. I made my own speech earlier, and I was disappointed that I wasn't confronted by Liberal MPs after that, because I made some serious allegations about the lack of results from the Liberal side when it comes to infrastructure. And as my colleague just mentioned, I have questions about the infrastructure bank. Does my colleague not realize that the infrastructure bank will take $15 billion of funding that people from his riding could have used, and the infrastructure bank won't be interested in investing in projects in his community because there's not a high level of population density like there is in Toronto and Vancouver? And does he not realize that if investing in infrastructure is so urgent, and I agree with him on that, well, the infrastructure bank is going to be put in place in 2017, but 2/3 of the funding that he's just mentioned, 2/3 of it won't be available before 2021, 2022, 2 elections down the road. So how does he reconcile what he said in his speech with the facts that were brought up in the government's fall economic update?
Bay of Quinte.
I'd like to thank the honourable member for his question. And when we talk about timeframes and planning and infrastructure, we all know that infrastructure is built, and it's built for a 20 or 30-year period. And in past experience, infrastructure, to get it launched, is usually probably 3 years or 4 years to get a shovel in the ground. And past experience, when you look at a city intersection, and you say to your staff, you say, I give you all the resources and all the money to complete that infrastructure. By the time you do your needs study, your environmental study, it takes a long time to implement programs and get them out. So it's about planning in a cycle. And my daughter that attends Queen's University in her MBA program phoned me the other day and asked me a similar question to the honourable members, Mr. Speaker, and said, you know, you're planning outside the election cycle. Well, it's about us looking at what the total infrastructure is and making plans out of that cycle and building a 10 or a 15-year plan to totally create a plan that does eliminate infrastructure. And if the honourable member or any members want to run on their next election about cancelling the infrastructure program or not extending it past our mandate, I would like them to do that. Thank you.